On the evening of September 27, 1984, a 48-year-old FBI counterintelligence agent named Richard William Miller drove to a telephone booth in West Los Angeles and made a call that would destroy his life. He had been an agent for 20 years. He had 8 children. He had a wife named Paula, who had stood by him through career setbacks and financial problems and the quiet humiliation of watching younger agents advance past him. And on that Thursday night, standing in a phone booth with traffic passing on the street behind him, he called a Soviet émigré named Svetlana Ogorodnikov to tell her he had classified FBI documents she could give to the KGB. The call lasted 3 minutes and 41 seconds. Miller did not know that FBI surveillance teams had been following him for weeks. He did not know that the phone line was tapped. He did not know that his own colleagues had been building a case against him since early August, when another agent noticed something unusual about his relationship with a Soviet couple living in West Hollywood. What Miller knew was that he was in love with a woman he had met in the spring, that she had told him she worked for Soviet intelligence, that he had access to classified information, and that he believed he could help her while somehow protecting himself and his family and his career. He was wrong about almost everything. Richard Miller's descent into espionage was not the story of an ideological traitor or a sophisticated intelligence operative. It was the story of a failing FBI agent who fell in love with a woman who worked for the KGB, who convinced himself he could manage the situation, who made a series of increasingly desperate decisions, and who became the first FBI agent in the Bureau's history to be convicted of espionage. The case exposed not just one man's betrayal, but the systemic failures that made it possible. The Bureau's reluctance to acknowledge problems within its own ranks, the surveillance gaps that allowed Soviet intelligence to operate in American cities, and the human vulnerabilities that no security clearance process could eliminate. But before any of that, there was Richard Miller's ordinary life, which by 1984 had become a catalogue of small failures and quiet disappointments. Miller had joined the FBI in 1964, recruited directly from Brigham Young University, where he had studied Spanish and prepared for what he imagined would be a distinguished career in federal law enforcement. He was 28 years old, married to his college sweetheart, devout in his Mormon faith, eager to serve his country. The Bureau assigned him to the field office in Los Angeles, where he worked counterintelligence cases involving Soviet operations on the West Coast. In the early years, he performed adequately. His supervisors noted in evaluations that he was hard-working, reliable, committed. He and Paula started a family. They had 4 children by 1970, would eventually have 8. They lived in a modest house in the San Fernando Valley, attended church regularly, maintained the appearance of a stable middle-class family. The problems began slowly, accumulating over years. Miller struggled with his weight, eventually reaching nearly 250 pounds on a frame not built to carry it. He had difficulty with the physical requirements of the job. His marksmanship scores were consistently low, and he failed the annual fitness tests. Colleagues noticed that he seemed perpetually exhausted, overwhelmed by the demands of a large family and a job that required long hours and constant vigilance. In the late 1970s, the Bureau transferred him from active counterintelligence work to a less demanding position handling foreign counterintelligence sources who had already been recruited and were providing information voluntarily. It was a quiet demotion, the kind the FBI handled by reassignment rather than formal discipline. By 1982, Miller was working out of a small office in the Westwood area of Los Angeles, managing a handful of sources, generating little in the way of useful intelligence. His colleagues described him as disorganized, sloppy in his paperwork, frequently late to meetings. His supervisors noted continuing problems with his performance, but took no decisive action. The Bureau's culture at the time discouraged confronting agents directly about personal or professional failures. Miller was allowed to coast, doing the minimum, collecting his paycheck, counting the years until retirement. He was also going broke. Supporting 8 children on a government salary had become increasingly difficult. Paula managed the household finances and tried to make the money stretch, but there were constant pressures: school expenses, medical bills, the costs of maintaining a house and 2 vehicles. Miller began borrowing money. He took out loans from credit unions, borrowed from family members, fell behind on payments. By 1984, he was drowning in debt with no clear way forward. He was 48 years old, nearly 250 pounds, exhausted, financially desperate, professionally stalled, and increasingly isolated from his colleagues and his faith community. This was the man Svetlana Ogorodnikov met in the spring of 1984, and she understood immediately that he was vulnerable. Svetlana and her husband Nikolai had emigrated from the Soviet Union to the United States in 1973, part of the wave of Soviet Jews allowed to leave during the détente period. They settled initially in San Francisco, then moved to Los Angeles in the early 1980s. Svetlana was in her early 30s, attractive, with platinum blonde hair and a vivacious personality that drew attention in any room. Nikolai was quieter, less charismatic, working various odd jobs, while Svetlana tried to establish herself in the émigré community. To their neighbors and acquaintances in West Hollywood, they appeared to be typical Soviet émigrés, struggling financially, adapting to American life, maintaining ties to the Russian-speaking community. In reality, they were both working for the KGB. The details of their recruitment remain partially classified, but declassified FBI documents and testimony from later trials indicate that the KGB had cultivated them before they left the Soviet Union. The usual pattern involved identifying émigrés who could be useful in gathering intelligence or recruiting potential sources among other Soviet émigrés in the United States. Svetlana's role was primarily social. She attended émigré gatherings, befriended new arrivals, identified people who might be useful to Soviet intelligence. Nikolai provided support and occasionally handled communications with their KGB handlers in San Francisco. Neither of them was a trained intelligence officer. They were support assets, low-level operatives conducting basic intelligence gathering and talent spotting. By 1984, Svetlana had been working this role for several years with minimal success. The FBI's Los Angeles field office was aware of the Ogorodnikovs and suspected they had some connection to Soviet intelligence, but surveillance resources were limited, and the couple was considered low priority. They were noted in files, occasionally observed, but not under active investigation. The Bureau's counterintelligence division was focused on more significant Soviet operations and higher-value targets. Then, in May 1984, Svetlana met Richard Miller. The initial contact occurred through Miller's work as a handler of émigré sources. One of his sources mentioned knowing a Soviet couple who might have information useful to the Bureau. Miller, always looking for an easy win that might improve his standing with supervisors, arranged to meet the Ogorodnikovs at their apartment in West Hollywood on May 13, 1984. It was supposed to be a routine assessment interview, the kind Miller had conducted dozens of times. He would meet the couple, evaluate whether they had useful information or contacts, write a brief report, and likely never see them again. The meeting lasted approximately 2 hours. Nikolai was present, but said little. Svetlana dominated the conversation, talking about her life in the Soviet Union, the émigré community in Los Angeles, her observations about Soviet intelligence activities. She was charming, and attentive. She laughed at Miller's jokes. She touched his arm when making points. She expressed admiration for the FBI in America and everything Miller represented. Miller left the meeting convinced that Svetlana Ogorodnikov was genuinely interested in helping U.S. intelligence and that she found him personally impressive. He was spectacularly wrong on both counts. What Miller failed to understand was that Svetlana had identified him as a potential recruitment target the moment he walked through the door. She saw a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit who arrived late and apologized too much. She saw someone who seemed desperate for validation, who responded to her attention with visible pleasure, who seemed lonely despite being married with a large family. She saw exactly what she had been trained to look for. An FBI agent with access to classified information who might be vulnerable to manipulation. The relationship developed rapidly over the following weeks. Miller returned to the apartment in West Hollywood several times, ostensibly to continue debriefing Svetlana about her knowledge of Soviet intelligence operations. No formal recruitment as a source was ever processed through proper FBI channels. No paperwork was filed. Miller simply visited Svetlana, and soon Nikolai began conveniently absenting himself from these meetings. By early June, the relationship had become sexual. Miller would later claim in court testimony that he believed he was running a sophisticated counterintelligence operation, that he was deliberately cultivating Svetlana as a source who might lead him to more significant Soviet intelligence activities. FBI protocols required extensive documentation of source relationships, regular reports to supervisors, and strict prohibition of sexual relationships with sources under any circumstances. Miller followed none of these protocols. He met Svetlana secretly, told no one at the bureau, kept no records. He began spending afternoons at the apartment in West Hollywood while he was supposed to be working. He called her from payphones. He lied to Paula about where he was spending his time. By July 1984, Svetlana had begun asking Miller for classified information. The approach was gradual, almost conversational. She would ask about FBI procedures for monitoring Soviet émigrés. She would inquire about specific cases she had heard about through the community. She would wonder aloud about how the Bureau tracked Soviet intelligence officers in the United States. Miller, wanting to impress her and prove his importance, began answering these questions in detail. He did not initially provide documents. He simply talked, sharing information about FBI counterintelligence operations that his oath required him to protect. Then, in early August, Svetlana told Miller that she worked for the KGB. The conversation occurred in the apartment on a Thursday afternoon. Nikolai was out. Svetlana and Miller had spent several hours together. According to Miller's testimony during his interrogation, Svetlana explained that she had been working for Soviet intelligence since before leaving the USSR, that she had been instructed to identify potential intelligence sources among FBI agents and government officials, and that she believed Miller could help Soviet intelligence while also helping himself financially. She proposed a specific arrangement. Miller would provide classified FBI documents about Soviet intelligence operations in the United States. In exchange, the KGB would pay him $65,000 in gold and arrange for him and his family to live comfortably, either in the United States or potentially in the Soviet Union if necessary. Miller's response to this recruitment pitch revealed the depth of his desperation and capacity for self-deception. He did not immediately refuse. He did not report the recruitment attempt to his supervisors as FBI regulations explicitly required. He did not end the relationship. Instead, he convinced himself that he could turn the situation to his advantage, that he could pretend to cooperate with the KGB, provide them with information that seemed valuable, but was actually useless, and somehow used the relationship to advance his FBI career by exposing a major Soviet intelligence operation. It was delusional thinking, and on some level Miller probably knew it, but he was in love with Svetlana, or believed he was. He was drowning in debt. He was professionally desperate, and he was being offered money and importance and the attention of a woman who made him feel significant. So he said yes. Over the next 6 weeks, Miller provided Svetlana with classified FBI documents on 3 separate occasions. The exact contents of these documents remain partially classified, but testimony and court records indicate they included a classified FBI manual describing counterintelligence procedures, information about ongoing FBI surveillance of Soviet intelligence officers in Los Angeles, details about FBI sources within the Soviet émigré community, and assessment reports on suspected KGB operations in California. Miller did not simply hand over random documents. He selected materials he believed would be valuable to the KGB while supposedly protecting more sensitive operations. Another layer of self-deception that allowed him to rationalize his actions. He photocopied documents at the FBI field office, smuggled them out in his briefcase, and delivered them to Svetlana during afternoon meetings at the apartment. Each time, she expressed gratitude and admiration. Each time, she promised that payment was being arranged. Each time, Miller convinced himself he was still in control of the situation. He was not. The FBI had been watching him since early August. The surveillance began because of a routine security check that occurred after another FBI agent noticed Miller spending an unusual amount of time away from the office. The agent mentioned it to a supervisor, who checked Miller's activity reports and found discrepancies. Miller had been logging office hours when he was actually elsewhere. The supervisor initiated a low-level inquiry, which led to the discovery that Miller had been meeting regularly with Soviet émigrés who were in FBI files as suspected KGB assets. On August 13, 1984, the FBI's Internal Affairs Division was notified and authorized to begin discreet surveillance of Special Agent Richard William Miller. The surveillance teams followed Miller to the apartment in West Hollywood. They photographed him entering and leaving at times when he had no official reason to be there. They documented the hours he spent inside. They ran background checks on Svetlana and Nikolai Ogorodnikov and discovered the full extent of their suspected KGB connections. By late August, the surveillance had been escalated to include wiretaps on the Ogorodnikovs' phone line and round-the-clock watch on their apartment. The FBI knew Miller was having an affair with a suspected KGB asset. They did not yet have evidence he was providing classified information. That evidence emerged gradually through the wiretaps. Conversations between Svetlana and Nikolai, conducted in Russian and later translated, included references to documents and materials that Miller was providing. Surveillance teams observed Miller carrying his FBI briefcase into the apartment on several occasions when there was no official justification for him to be meeting the Ogorodnikovs. On September 24, 1984, surveillance teams observed Miller photocopying documents at the FBI field office late in the evening when he had no active cases requiring such work. The next day, he was observed delivering a manila envelope to Svetlana at the apartment. The Bureau's Internal Affairs Division now faced a difficult decision. They had strong evidence that an FBI agent was providing classified information to Soviet intelligence assets, but they had not yet caught Miller in the act with sufficient certainty to guarantee a conviction. If they moved too soon, Miller might claim the relationship was legitimate counterintelligence work and that any documents provided were part of an authorized operation. If they waited too long, more classified information might be compromised. They decided to wait for Miller to make definitive contact that clearly demonstrated intent to commit espionage. That contact came on September 27th in the phone booth in West Los Angeles. Miller called Svetlana at approximately 8:47 p.m. The call was recorded. According to the transcript later entered into evidence, Miller asked if Quote 2 were ready to finalize arrangements. He said he had additional materials that would be valuable. He suggested meeting the following week to discuss next steps. The conversation lasted 3 minutes and 41 seconds. The tape was transcribed the same night. The phrase, Quote 3, was understood by FBI counterintelligence analysts to be a reference to KGB handlers. It was standard tradecraft language used by assets when discussing their intelligence contacts. By the morning of September 28th, the decision had been made to arrest Richard Miller and the Ogorodnikovs. The arrests occurred simultaneously on October 3, 1984. FBI agents came to Miller's house in the San Fernando Valley at approximately 6:15 a.m. He was preparing for work, standing in the kitchen in his suit trousers and undershirt. Paula was making breakfast for the children who were still at home. The agents identified themselves, showed their credentials, and told Miller he was under arrest for espionage. They allowed him to finish dressing. They handcuffed him in the living room while Paula and the children watched. According to later testimony from neighbors, Paula Miller could be heard screaming, "There must be some mistake. He would never do this," as agents led her husband to a waiting car. At the same time, other teams arrested Svetlana and Nikolai at their apartment in West Hollywood. Both were taken into custody without incident. FBI agents seized documents, photographs, and communication equipment from the apartment. Among the materials recovered were photocopies of the classified FBI documents Miller had provided, along with handwritten notes in Russian that appeared to be summaries prepared for transmission to Soviet handlers in San Francisco. Miller was transported to the FBI's Los Angeles field office, the same building where he had worked for 20 years, where he knew the layout of every floor, where his colleagues had once trusted him. He was placed in an interrogation room and read his Miranda rights at 7:52 a.m. He waived his right to an attorney, a decision that legal experts would later describe as catastrophic. For the next 6 hours, he was interrogated by FBI agents who had been his colleagues, some of them for 2 decades. The interrogation transcripts, later entered into evidence, reveal a man desperately trying to maintain the fiction that he had been conducting a legitimate counterintelligence operation. Miller claimed he had deliberately allowed Svetlana to believe he was providing genuine classified information while actually feeding her false material designed to mislead the KGB. He claimed he had been planning to expose the entire operation at the right moment, that he was building a comprehensive case. He claimed he had been documenting everything and was about to make a full report to his supervisors. When confronted with the recorded phone call from September 27th, he claimed it was part of his cover. When confronted with preliminary testimony from Svetlana and Nikolai, who had both quickly agreed to cooperate with investigators, he insisted his story would be vindicated. The interrogators did not believe him. The evidence was overwhelming. Miller had violated every FBI protocol governing source relationships and classified information handling. He had engaged in a sexual relationship with a suspected KGB asset. He had failed to report a direct recruitment attempt by Soviet intelligence. He had removed classified documents from FBI facilities without authorization. He had lied to supervisors about his activities and whereabouts. And he had been caught on tape discussing the provision of materials to Quote 5, a phrase that, in the context of counterintelligence work, could only refer to hostile intelligence services. By early evening on October 3rd, Miller's story had collapsed. Faced with the wiretap recordings, the testimony from the Ogorodnikovs, and the physical evidence of classified documents seized from the apartment, he admitted providing the materials. He still insisted he had been trying to run a counterintelligence operation, but he acknowledged that he had gone about it improperly and without proper authorization. He admitted the sexual relationship with Svetlana. He admitted taking money, $1,500 in cash that Svetlana had given him as an advance on the promised $65,000 payment. He admitted he had been desperate for money and had made errors in judgment. What he would not admit during the interrogation or at any point in the years that followed was that he had committed treason against the United States. The formal charges were filed in federal court on October 5, 1984. Richard William Miller was charged with conspiracy to commit espionage under Title 18, United States Code, Section 794, which carried a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. Svetlana and Nikolai Ogorodnikov were charged with the same offense. The case was assigned to the United States District Court for the Central District of California. The presiding judge was David Kenyon. It was the first time in the FBI's 76-year history that one of its agents had been charged with espionage. The pre-trial proceedings stretched through the fall and winter of 1984. Miller's attorney, Joel Levine, attempted multiple defense strategies. He argued that Miller had been conducting a legitimate counterintelligence operation that had simply gone wrong due to procedural errors. He claimed Miller had been entrapped by Svetlana, who had exploited his emotional vulnerability and financial desperation. He suggested that Miller's Mormon faith and devotion to his family proved he could never intentionally betray his country. None of these arguments gained traction with prosecutors, who presented the mountain of documentary evidence, wiretap recordings, and cooperating witness testimony. The Ogorodnikovs, meanwhile, had entered into cooperation agreements with federal prosecutors. Both agreed to testify against Miller in exchange for reduced sentences. Svetlana's testimony would prove particularly damaging. In her debriefing sessions with FBI agents, she provided detailed accounts of her recruitment by the KGB before leaving the Soviet Union, her specific instructions to identify potential intelligence sources among government employees in the United States, her assessment of Miller as a vulnerable target, and the classified documents he had provided. She described the sexual relationship in clinical, unemotional detail. She explained without apparent remorse how she had manipulated Miller's emotional needs and financial desperation to secure his cooperation. When asked by prosecutors why she had targeted an FBI agent with 8 children, she responded, quote, "The first trial began on May 6, 1985, in federal court in Los Angeles. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They presented the wiretap recordings of Miller's September 27th phone call and numerous conversations between the Ogorodnikovs discussing, quote, 9, quote, and, quote, 10, quote. They called Svetlana to the stand, where she testified for 2 full days about Miller's provision of classified documents and his statements about wanting to help Soviet intelligence. She testified that Miller had told her he needed money to support his family and saw cooperation with the KGB as a way to solve his financial problems, while also, in his mind, advancing his FBI career by eventually exposing a Soviet operation. The prosecution introduced the documents seized from the West Hollywood apartment, including photocopies of classified FBI materials that bore Miller's fingerprints. They called FBI agents who testified about proper procedures for handling sources and classified information, and how Miller had violated every single protocol. They presented financial records showing Miller's desperate situation, more than $40,000 in debt across various loans and credit cards, and evidence of the $1,000. 500 cash payment from Svetlana. They introduced Miller's own statements from his October 3rd interrogation, in which he admitted providing the documents while claiming he was running an unauthorized counterintelligence operation. Miller's defense was confused and often contradictory. Against the advice of many legal observers, he chose to testify in his own defense. On the stand, he maintained that he had been running a counterintelligence operation designed to infiltrate a KGB network, but he could provide no documentation, no reports to supervisors, no evidence of any legitimate FBI authorization. He admitted providing classified documents, but claimed they contained information that was largely useless or already compromised. He admitted the sexual relationship with Svetlana, but claimed it was necessary to maintain his cover and convince her he was genuinely cooperating. He became visibly emotional when discussing his family, weeping on the stand as he spoke about his children. But the testimony did little to help his case, and may have undermined it by highlighting his willingness to betray them. The jury deliberated for approximately 8 hours over 2 days. On June 19, 1985, they returned a verdict: guilty on all counts, including conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized removal of classified documents, and providing classified information to agents of a foreign power. Richard Miller sat motionless as the verdict was read, staring straight ahead. Paula, who had attended every day of the trial despite the humiliating testimony about her husband's affair with a Soviet agent, began to cry quietly. Several of their children, those old enough to understand what was happening, sat in the courtroom and watched their father convicted of the most serious betrayal an FBI agent could commit. Sentencing occurred on July 30th, 1985. Judge Kenyon reviewed the case extensively before announcing his decision. He noted the extraordinary seriousness of Miller's betrayal, the damage to national security, and the profound violation of the FBI's trust. He also acknowledged Miller's 20 years of service, his financial desperation, and what the judge described as Miller's, quote, 12. The sentence was 20 years in federal prison on the espionage conspiracy charge, plus additional time on lesser charges, to be served consecutively. With good behavior and credit for time served, Miller might be eligible for parole after approximately 13 years. Svetlana Ogorodnikov, because of her extensive cooperation with federal authorities, received a sentence of 18 years. Nikolai received 13 years. Both would eventually serve less time than their sentences indicated, receiving further reductions for continued cooperation with investigators. Miller was transported to the federal penitentiary in Phoenix, Arizona, to begin serving his sentence. He was 49 years old. His career was destroyed. His family was facing bankruptcy. His name had become synonymous with betrayal. Headlines across the country had called him, quote, 13, quote, 14. And he still insisted. In conversations with his court-appointed attorney and in letters to Paula and his children, that he had not really committed espionage, but had simply made procedural errors while trying to serve his country. What happened next should have been the end of the story. But the Miller case had an unexpected complication. In 1986, Miller's appellate attorneys discovered a technical error in the jury instructions from the first trial. The judge had failed to properly instruct the jury on the specific intent requirement for espionage charges under Section 794, specifically that the prosecution needed to prove Miller intended to harm the United States or aid a foreign power, not merely that he provided classified information. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals reviewed the issue and, in a decision that surprised many legal observers, overturned the conviction and ordered a new trial. Miller was returned to Los Angeles in late 1987 to be tried again on the same charges. The second trial began in October 1987. The evidence was essentially identical to the first trial. The same wiretap recordings, the same documents, the same witness testimony from Svetlana and FBI agents. Miller's defense was largely unchanged, still centered on the claim that he had been conducting an unauthorized but well-intentioned counterintelligence operation. But this time, his attorneys had refined their strategy, focusing more explicitly on the argument that Miller had believed he was serving FBI interests and thus lacked the specific intent to harm the United States or aid the Soviet Union. The jury in the second trial deadlocked. After 4 days of deliberation, they reported they could not reach a unanimous verdict. They were split, with some jurors believing the government had proven intent to commit espionage and others believing Miller's claims that he had been attempting a counterintelligence operation, however misguided. Judge Kenyon declared a mistrial on November 18, 1987. Miller remained in custody, but federal prosecutors now faced the prospect of a third trial with no guarantee of conviction. The government decided to proceed. The stakes were too high. The first FBI agent ever charged with espionage could not simply walk free on a technicality. The third trial began in June 1988, more than 3.5 years after Miller's initial arrest. By this point, the case had dragged on through multiple proceedings. Witnesses were exhausted from repeated testimony. The media attention had diminished, but the government remained determined to secure a conviction. The third trial lasted 6 weeks and followed the same pattern as the previous 2. The prosecution presented their evidence: wiretaps, documents, co-testimony. The defense presented Miller's claim of misguided counterintelligence work. The jury received the case on October 7, 1988. They deliberated for 9 days, an unusually long time that suggested significant disagreement, before finally reaching a verdict on October 16, 1988. Guilty on 6 of 7 counts, including conspiracy to commit espionage. The single count on which Miller was acquitted involved a technical aspect of document classification procedures. The acquittal had no practical impact on his sentence or the overall verdict. Judge Kenyon sentenced Miller to 20 years in federal prison, nearly identical to the sentence from the first trial. With credit for time already served since his 1984 arrest and good behavior projections, Miller could expect to remain in prison until approximately 1996 or 1997. He was 52 years old when the third trial ended. He had been incarcerated or awaiting trial for 4 years. Paula had filed for divorce in early 1986, unable to continue supporting him emotionally or financially, or to maintain the fiction of their marriage in the face of his infidelity and betrayal. Most of their children, now teenagers or young adults, had minimal contact with him. His name remained synonymous with betrayal in FBI circles and beyond. Former colleagues refused to speak his name. And yet, in prison interviews conducted in the early 1990s by researchers studying espionage cases, Miller continued to describe himself as the victim of a misunderstanding and institutional scapegoating. In these interviews, Miller claimed he had been trying to help the FBI by infiltrating a KGB operation using methods that, while unorthodox, were justified by the potential intelligence gain. He expressed anger at Svetlana Ogorodnikov, claiming she had deceived him and manipulated him for Soviet purposes, while simultaneously describing their relationship in terms that suggested he still carried feelings for her years later. He showed more concern for his own damaged reputation than for the harm his actions had caused to national security, to FBI counterintelligence operations, or to his family. Psychologists who evaluated Miller during his incarceration noted significant patterns of self-deception and an inability to accept full responsibility for his choices. They described a man who had constructed an elaborate internal narrative in which he was simultaneously a victim of circumstance and a misunderstood hero, rather than a traitor who had violated his oath for money and the attention of a woman who was using him. The damage Miller caused extended far beyond the specific classified documents he provided to Svetlana. His case exposed fundamental weaknesses in the FBI's internal security apparatus and culture. It revealed that agents could operate for weeks without meaningful supervision, that security violations could go unnoticed or unreported, and that the Bureau's culture of institutional loyalty sometimes prevented honest assessment of agent performance and intervention when problems became apparent. In the years following Miller's conviction, the FBI implemented significant reforms. New counterintelligence protocols for monitoring agents with access to sensitive information, enhanced supervision requirements, more rigorous psychological screening and periodic reevaluation, and mandatory reporting requirements for any contact with foreign nationals beyond routine casework. But the case also had a deeply personal human cost that extended in directions Miller probably never considered, or, if he did consider, chose to ignore. Paula Miller was left to raise the remaining children at home alone after filing for divorce in early 1986. The family lost their house in the San Fernando Valley to foreclosure. They lost their standing in their Mormon ward, where Richard had once been respected. The older children, who were young adults when their father was arrested, struggled with the profound stigma of being Richard Miller's children. Two of them legally changed their last names. Several moved away from California entirely and cut contact with extended family members who shared the Miller name. The shame and humiliation of their father's actions rippled through their lives in ways that persisted for decades, affecting job prospects, relationships, their ability to trust others or themselves. Miller's youngest children were particularly affected. They had been small when their father was arrested in 1984, some barely school-age, one still a toddler. They grew up knowing their father only as an imprisoned traitor, visiting him occasionally in federal facilities accompanied by their mother or older siblings, trying to reconcile the vague memories they had of a father who had lived with them briefly, with the man who had betrayed his country for money, and a relationship with a Soviet agent. In interviews conducted years later by researchers studying the families of convicted spies, some of these children described feeling a sense of fundamental unreality about their childhoods, as though the stable family life they remembered from before 1984 was a fiction that had been revealed as false, leaving them uncertain about what parts of their early memories could be trusted. One of Miller's daughters, who spoke anonymously to a researcher in 2001, described learning the full details of her father's case when she was 16 years old. Her mother had told her only that their father had made serious mistakes at work and was in prison. When she researched the case herself at a public library, reading newspaper accounts of the trials, she learned about the affair with Svetlana, the classified documents, the money. "I realized my father had traded our family for $1,500 and a woman who didn't care about him," she said in the interview. "And the worst part was that he still didn't seem to understand what he'd done, even after all those years." Svetlana Ogorodnikov served approximately 9 years of her 18-year sentence before being paroled in 1993 for good behavior and continued cooperation with federal authorities. She was immediately deported to Russia, where she gave occasional interviews to Russian media outlets about her role in the Miller case. In these interviews, she expressed no remorse for her actions. She described herself as a loyal Soviet citizen who had followed her instructions and fulfilled her duties to Soviet intelligence. She seemed bemused by American outrage over the case, suggesting that espionage was simply a normal aspect of international relations and that Miller had understood what he was doing and had made his own choices as an adult. When asked in a 1998 interview with a Russian newspaper about the affair with Miller, she dismissed it as an operational necessity, something she did because it was useful for accomplishing her mission. She described Miller as weak and foolish, but expressed no particular sympathy for him as a victim of Soviet manipulation. "He was a grown man, an FBI agent," she said. "He knew what he was doing." Nikolai Ogorodnikov served his full 13-year sentence with reductions for good behavior and was also deported to Russia upon release in 1997. He gave no interviews and disappeared from public view. Soviet intelligence records declassified after the fall of the USSR in 1991 confirm that both Ogorodnikovs had been working for the KGB as support assets, but suggest they were considered relatively low-level operatives whose recruitment of an FBI agent was viewed by their handlers as an unexpected success rather than the result of sophisticated planning or tradecraft. Richard Miller was released from federal prison on May 4, 1994, after serving just over 10 years of his sentence with credit for good behavior and time served. He was 58 years old. He had no career, no family waiting for him, no financial resources, no prospects for employment in any field requiring background checks or security clearances. He moved to a small apartment in Provo, Utah, near Brigham Young University, where his career in the FBI had begun 3 decades earlier. He found occasional work, security guard positions, warehouse jobs, but struggled to maintain employment once employers learned his background. His health had deteriorated significantly during his incarceration. He was massively obese, diabetic, suffering from various complications related to years of poor diet and minimal exercise in federal facilities. He gave a handful of interviews to journalists in the late 1990s, still attempting to explain his actions as misunderstood rather than criminal. He maintained that he had been trying to help the FBI, that the trials had been unfair, that he had been made a scapegoat for larger institutional failures within the Bureau. When confronted by interviewers with specific evidence from his trials, the wiretap transcripts, Svetlana's testimony, the classified documents found in the Ogorodnikov's apartment bearing his fingerprints, he became confused and defensive, unable to reconcile the documented facts with his preferred narrative of events. Journalists who interviewed him during this period came away convinced that Miller genuinely believed his own revisionist history, that he had successfully convinced himself over the years that he had been more victim than perpetrator. In 2000, Miller suffered a major heart attack while working a night shift as a security guard at a shopping center in Provo. He survived, but was left in significantly diminished health. He moved into subsidized housing for disabled individuals and lived on Social Security disability payments and a minimal pension from his FBI service. He retained some pension benefits despite his conviction because of a technicality. He had not been formally discharged from the FBI until after completing 20 years of service, which vested certain retirement benefits that could not be revoked even after criminal conviction. The pension amounted to approximately $800 per month. It was a source of ongoing outrage among his former FBI colleagues, many of whom believed a convicted traitor should receive nothing from the government he had betrayed. Miller maintained sporadic contact with a few of his 8 children during these final years, but the relationships remained strained and distant at best. Some of his children refused to speak with him at all, viewing him as having betrayed not just his country, but them personally. Others maintained minimal contact out of a residual sense of filial duty or childhood affection for the father they had known before 1984, but even these relationships were marked by tension and unresolved anger. The fundamental question they asked over and over in their limited interactions was the same question that haunted the entire case. Why? Why would a father of 8 children, a 20-year FBI veteran, a devout Mormon, betray everything for money he never actually received and a relationship with a woman who was obviously using him? Miller never provided a satisfying answer to this question because he never really understood it himself. When he discussed the case in his final years, he focused on external factors: Svetlana's manipulation of his emotions, his desperate financial situation, the FBI's failure to provide adequate support to struggling agents with large families. These were contributing factors, certainly, but they did not fully explain his choices. Thousands of FBI agents faced severe financial pressure. Thousands struggled with weight problems and career disappointments and feelings of being undervalued. None of them committed espionage. Miller did because of some specific combination of vulnerability, self-deception, narcissism, and moral weakness that allowed him to convince himself he could betray his oath while somehow remaining fundamentally loyal, that he could provide classified documents to the KGB while simultaneously serving FBI interests. Richard Miller died on October 16, 2002, in a nursing facility in Provo, Utah, 18 years to the day after the jury in his third trial had returned their guilty verdict. He was 66 years old. The cause of death was listed as complications from diabetes and congestive heart failure. His obituary in the Provo Daily Herald made no mention of his FBI career or his conviction for espionage, describing him simply as a father and grandfather who had passed away after a long illness. Only 3 of his 8 children attended the funeral, a small service at a Mormon chapel. None of his former FBI colleagues came. He was buried in a municipal cemetery under a simple marker that bore his name and dates of birth and death, with no mention of his service or his crimes. Svetlana Ogorodnikov outlived him by 11 years, but maintained no contact with any parties from the case after her deportation. She gave her last known interview in 2007, on the anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which she reflected on her work for the KGB with what the interviewer described as wistful nostalgia. She described the Miller operation as not particularly difficult and expressed mild surprise that it had caused such lasting scandal in the United States. In Russia, we understood that this was simply how intelligence services operated. "Ah," she said, "the Americans seem to take it very personally." She died in Moscow in February 2013 at the age of 68 from cancer. Russian news services noted her passing with brief articles that identified her as a former Soviet intelligence operative who had recruited an FBI agent. American media largely ignored her death, with only a small item appearing in the Los Angeles Times, noting the passing of a Soviet agent involved in a 1980s espionage case. The classified FBI documents Miller provided to the Ogorodnikovs remain classified to this day. The Bureau has never fully disclosed what specific operations were compromised or what precise damage was done to national security or to individuals whose identities may have been revealed. Damage assessments conducted in the late 1980s and declassified in redacted form in the 2000s suggest the impact was significant but not catastrophic. Miller had access to sensitive counterintelligence information, but not to the most critical ongoing operations or the identities of the highest value sources. Some FBI sources within the Soviet émigré community in California were compromised and had to be relocated or withdrawn from intelligence work. Some surveillance operations targeting suspected KGB officers had to be shut down or redesigned. But the American intelligence community survived, adapted its procedures, and continued its work. The question of responsibility in cases like this is complicated because it requires us to assign blame among individuals who were all to some degree acting according to the logic of the systems they inhabited. Richard Miller was responsible for his own choices. No one forced him to begin an affair with Svetlana Ogorodnikov. No one forced him to provide classified documents. No one forced him to lie to his supervisors and colleagues for months. He made those decisions consciously and repeatedly, and he paid for them with his career, his family, his freedom, and ultimately his life spent in disgrace and isolation. But Miller was also the product of an FBI that had allowed him to coast for years, despite obvious and documented performance problems, that had failed to provide adequate supervision or meaningful support, that had created a culture where agents were reluctant to report personal or professional difficulties for fear of career consequences or institutional embarrassment. The Bureau's own internal review after Miller's conviction identified multiple points at which intervention might have prevented the espionage. Supervisors who noted problems but took no action, colleagues who observed concerning behavior but didn't report it, a system that prioritized institutional reputation over honest assessment and accountability. Svetlana Ogorodnikov was responsible for her role as a KGB operative, for her deliberate assessment and manipulation of Miller's vulnerabilities, for her willingness to exploit another human being's emotional and financial desperation in service of Soviet intelligence objectives. But she was also operating within a system that had recruited her, trained her in basic intelligence tradecraft, and deployed her to do exactly what she did. She was a tool of Soviet intelligence, expendable and ultimately discarded when she was caught. Her actions were her own, but they were shaped and directed by the demands and values of the KGB and the Soviet system it served. The FBI bears institutional responsibility for the multiple failures that made the Miller case possible: the inadequate supervision of agents with security clearances, the tolerance of poor performance over years, the reluctance to confront agents about personal problems or financial difficulties, the security gaps that allowed an agent to remove classified documents and meet repeatedly with suspected KGB assets without triggering immediate investigation. The Bureau learned from these failures and implemented meaningful reforms, but that learning came at the cost of a major espionage case and significant damage to the institution's reputation and self-image. The KGB bears responsibility for targeting a vulnerable American for recruitment, for exploiting personal weaknesses in pursuit of intelligence objectives, for creating the conditions and applying the pressure that led to Miller's betrayal. But intelligence services, by their nature and mission, exploit human vulnerabilities. That is fundamentally what they do. Expecting the KGB to have operated differently would be expecting them not to function as an intelligence service, and at the center of all this institutional responsibility and systemic failure was Richard Miller's fundamental moral collapse, his decision to lie, to steal classified information, to betray his oath and his country, and then to spend the remaining 18 years of his life constructing and maintaining an elaborate fiction in which he had not really done these things or had done them for ultimately patriotic reasons. The children in this story bear no responsibility whatsoever. They were simply born into a family with a father who would eventually commit espionage, and they paid for his choices for the rest of their lives. They lost their stable home and their financial security. They lost their standing in their community. They lost the father they had known. They carried the stigma of his betrayal through their own careers, relationships, and attempts to build lives. Some of them struggled with fundamental issues of trust and attachment, wondering whether the love their father had shown them before his arrest was genuine or merely another form of the deception that seemed to define his character. They had no choice in any of it, but they bore profound and lasting consequences nonetheless. This pattern appears in nearly all espionage cases that involve families. The spy makes choices and pays certain penalties: prison, public disgrace, loss of career and status. But the children pay a different kind of price, one that extends through their entire lives, shaping their understanding of loyalty and trust and the fundamental reliability of the people who are supposed to protect them. They become what one researcher studying families of convicted spies called the invisible casualties of betrayal, people who committed no crime, made no choices, but inherited a legacy of shame and loss. The Miller case is notable in FBI history primarily because it was the first time an FBI agent was convicted of espionage against the United States. It shattered the Bureau's cherished image of itself as somehow immune to the vulnerabilities that affected other intelligence agencies and government institutions. It forced a painful institutional reckoning with the reality that having an FBI badge and security clearance did not make someone trustworthy, that rigorous background checks did not eliminate human weakness or moral failure, and that institutional prestige and esprit de corps could not protect against individual betrayal when the right combination of pressures and opportunities arose. In the decades since Miller's conviction, there have been other FBI agents arrested for espionage or related offenses. Robert Hansen, arrested in 2001, committed far more serious and sustained betrayals over a 22-year period and caused vastly greater damage to national security, compromising dozens of operations and leading directly to the execution of at least 3 Soviet sources working for U.S. intelligence. Earl Pitts, arrested in 1996, sold classified information to Soviet and later Russian intelligence over a 13-year period. Each of these cases echoed aspects of the Miller case: financial pressures, personal vulnerabilities, inadequate supervision, and the ability of trusted insiders to betray their institutions for extended periods without detection. But Richard Miller remains distinct because he was first and because his case was, in many ways, so pathetic and preventable. More sophisticated spies like Hansen at least understood what they were doing and why, even if their motivations were complex and sometimes contradictory. They knew they were traitors and accepted that identity with various degrees of defiance or rationalization. Miller never really accepted it. He died maintaining a version of his story in which he had been running an unauthorized counterintelligence operation that had gone wrong through procedural errors and institutional misunderstanding. He died believing he had been more victim than perpetrator, more scapegoat than traitor. In 2004, the FBI opened a small internal museum at its headquarters in Washington, D.C., featuring exhibits on the Bureau's history, including its failures and the lessons learned from them. One section focuses specifically on internal security failures and the agents who betrayed their oaths. Richard Miller is featured prominently in this exhibit, alongside Hansen and others. The display includes his photograph from his FBI personnel file from 1964, a young man, clean-cut and professional-looking, full of hope about his future career. There are also photographs from his arrest in 1984, his trials, and his time in prison, documenting the physical and psychological deterioration over 2 decades. The exhibit does not editorialize or moralize. It simply presents the facts of the case, the documents, the timeline, the consequences, as a sobering reminder to current FBI agents of what can happen when personal vulnerabilities are exploited. When procedural safeguards are ignored, and when individuals convince themselves that rules and oaths somehow do not apply to them or can be suspended in service of what they imagine to be a greater good. Richard Miller was 48 years old when he fell in love with a Soviet agent and convinced himself he could manage the situation to his advantage and everyone else's benefit. He was 52 when he was finally convicted after 3 trials and more than 3 years of legal proceedings. He was 58 when he was released from federal prison, his life and health destroyed. He was 66 when he died, having spent his final 8 years in poverty and isolation, having never achieved any real understanding of or accountability for what he had done. And in between those milestones, he lost everything: his career, his family, his freedom, his reputation, his health, and ultimately even his ability to see clearly what he had done and why he had done it. Paula Miller, who had married Richard when they were both students at Brigham Young University and who had borne 8 children with him and supported his FBI career through 20 years and countless disappointments, remarried in 1995 to a man she met through her Mormon ward. She moved away from California to Idaho and built a new life. She gave no interviews about her former husband and actively discouraged her children from discussing the case publicly or allowing it to define their lives. She died in September 2017 at the age of 77, having lived the last 33 years of her life, successfully rebuilding what Richard had destroyed. In her obituary, she was described as a devoted mother and grandmother who had overcome significant personal challenges with grace and faith. Richard was not mentioned. Of the 8 children, several went on to successful careers and stable families of their own, determinedly creating lives that bore no resemblance to the chaos and shame of their childhoods. Others struggled more visibly with the legacy of their father's betrayal, finding it difficult to trust institutions or authority figures, or sometimes even their own judgment. None of them ever publicly defended their father's actions. None of them appear to have maintained any meaningful relationship with him during his final years in Utah. They are, in many ways, the most forgotten victims of the case. People who committed no crime, exercised no agency in these events, made no choices, but paid a profound and lasting price nonetheless. The classified documents Miller provided to Svetlana Ogorodnikov were eventually assessed by FBI counterintelligence analysts to have caused moderate to significant damage to national security. Several ongoing FBI operations had to be terminated or substantially modified. Some sources cooperating with American intelligence were identified and later faced consequences: exile, loss of employment, in some cases worse. The full scope of the damage was never made public and likely never will be, remaining classified to protect sources and methods, but it was real, tangible, consequential damage that affected real people whose names we will never know and whose losses will never be publicly acknowledged. In the end, the Miller case is a story about the often vast distance between what people believe about themselves and what they actually are. Richard Miller believed he was a loyal FBI agent who had made some regrettable procedural errors while attempting to conduct an unconventional counterintelligence operation. In reality, he was a failing agent who fell in love with a KGB operative, provided her with classified documents that damaged national security, and then spent the remaining 18 years of his life unable or unwilling to acknowledge the simple truth of what he had done. The gap between these two versions of Richard Miller, the one he constructed in his mind and the one documented in court transcripts and FBI files, was vast, unbridgeable, and ultimately tragic. It is also a story about institutions and systems that fail to see or meaningfully address problems until those problems explode into crises. The FBI knew Miller was struggling professionally and personally. His supervisors documented his performance problems. His colleagues observed his isolation and apparent desperation. But the Bureau's culture at the time actively discouraged intervention, encouraged minimization of problems, and prioritized institutional reputation over honest assessment and accountability. By the time anyone took decisive action, it was too late. Miller had already been meeting with Svetlana Ogorodnikov for months. The classified documents had already been handed over. The damage was already done. And it is a story about the specific kind of tragedy that espionage creates, not just the betrayal of national secrets, but the destruction of families, the corruption of trust, the way a single person's choices can ripple outward to affect dozens or hundreds of other lives in ways both visible and hidden. When Richard Miller made that phone call from a booth in West Los Angeles on the evening of September 27, 1984, speaking in careful euphemisms about our friends and additional materials, he was not just betraying classified information or violating his security clearance. He was betraying his wife of 24 years, his 8 children who trusted him, his colleagues who had worked alongside him for 2 decades, the sources who had cooperated with the FBI believing their identities would be protected, and ultimately himself, his oath, his values, everything he had claimed to believe and stand for. He spent more than 10 years in federal prison, followed by 8 years of broken health, poverty, and isolation, before dying in a nursing home in Utah. His former wife outlived him by 15 years and successfully rebuilt a life. His children scattered across the country, most wanting nothing to do with the legacy he had created. The woman he thought he loved described him in later interviews as a useful fool who had made his own choices. The country he had served for 20 years remembered him only as the first FBI agent ever convicted of espionage, a historical footnote, a cautionary tale, a name invoked in FBI training about the dangers of personal vulnerability and institutional complacency. The final accounting of the Miller case includes convictions, sentences, prison time served, lives destroyed, and careers ended. But it also includes questions that remain not just unanswered, but perhaps unanswerable. How does someone with 20 years of honorable service convince themselves that betrayal has become acceptable? How does someone who swore a solemn oath decide that oath no longer meaningfully binds them? How does a father of 8 children decide that money he will never actually receive, and the temporary attention of a woman who is obviously manipulating him, are worth more than his family's future and his own integrity? Richard Miller never adequately answered these questions, not to prosecutors at any of his 3 trials, not to his family in the limited contact he maintained, not to journalists who interviewed him, and almost certainly not to himself. He died still believing some version of his own carefully constructed mythology, still convinced that he had been more misunderstood than justly convicted, still unable or unwilling to look clearly at what he had done and honestly confront why he had done it. That persistent inability, that almost willful blindness to his own choices and their consequences, may have been his most fundamental failure of all, more revealing of his character than even the act of espionage itself. The case file on United States versus Richard W. Miller remains active in FBI records. Periodically reviewed as part of institutional training and learning about counterintelligence failures and insider threats. The documents Miller provided to the Ogorodnikovs remain classified. The complete list of operations compromised remains secret. The full damage assessment has never been publicly released, and likely never will be. What is documented and known is that one FBI agent's betrayal required years of investigation and prosecution to address. damaged national security in ways both documented and suspected, destroyed multiple families, and left scars that persisted for decades. Richard Miller was 48 when he fell in love with a Soviet agent and convinced himself he could control a situation he fundamentally misunderstood. He was 52 when he was finally convicted after 3 separate trials. He was 58 when he was released from prison, broken in body and spirit and bankrupt in every sense. He was 66 when he died, believing to the end that he had been a victim of circumstance and institutional scapegoating rather than an architect of his own destruction. And in between those milestones, spread across 18 years, he lost everything, understood nothing, and left behind a legacy of failure and betrayal that outlived him and marked everyone who had ever trusted him or loved him or believed in him.